Welcome to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership, where you'll hear insights and useful strategies, as well as lessons learned from other nonprofit leaders and valuable tips from a variety of experts. Here to help you with the challenges and opportunities you face day after day is your host and nonprofit leadership expert, Sarah Olivieri.
Hello, nonprofit leaders, and welcome to your go-to place for information and inspiration to help you be even more effective. I'm your host, Sarah Olivieri, and you're listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. My guest for this episode is Takema Robinson, who is a mother, social justice strategist, philanthropist, art curator, podcast host, and CEO and founder of Converge, a national social justice consulting firm whose purpose is to accelerate the creation of a radically just new world where communities of color thrive. As a for-profit Black woman-owned company, Converge is unapologetically committed to investing its dollars in companies owned by people of color, women, and companies that demonstrate commitment to communities of color. She has over 20 years of experience in strategic philanthropy, policy advocacy, and fundraising. And she has built a company with clients like the Ford Foundation, the Walton Family Foundation, Walmart Foundation, and George Soros's Open Society Foundation, representing over $50 billion in philanthropic investment. Welcome, Takema, to the Inspired Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. It's such a pleasure to have you here today. Before we dive into our topic, I'd love it if you could just add any bits to your introduction, anything you'd love the audience to know about you as a whole person.
Yes, I am a whole person. And thank you, Sarah, for having me here. I'm excited to share with your audience today. So just want to start there with some gratitude for the invitation to your platform and the work that you're doing here. What other things to know about me? I am a native of Connecticut, so I am a New England girl at heart. I also went to the illustrious Howard University. So I'm very proud Bison, as is our vice president, current vice president. And what other? Fun fact, I live in Kingston, Jamaica, where I moved with my husband and two son during the pandemic. So I am having a bit of expat experience, and I think it's really deepening my larger commitment to global social justice. So I think we'll get into some of those things into our conversation today.
Yeah, well, let's dive right in. I think the first thing that I want to ask you about, since this is your specialty, is let's talk about strategies for operationalizing racial and intersectional justice. I think this is so important because all too often I hear about people doing like workshops or offsite things around social justice. But I don't hear a lot of people talking about operationalizing these things. So let's dive in. What are your top tips for folks who want to operationalize? How do people go about that?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for, diving right into the deep end. I do want to say that I think that those workshops and those things that are calling us into this work are really important. So I am glad that people are spending time learning and getting informed and doing some of the internal work, personal internal work to be ready to operationalize. So I would say part of operationalizing is actually, it starts in the learning, it starts in the curiosity, it starts in the openness and the vulnerability of leaning into this topic. So we want to give people credit for that work. I truly believe, and I'm so excited about this platform as it centers nonprofit leaders. I believe nonprofits and organizations, whether they be nonprofit or corporate, are where a lot of people are going to get these experiences. A lot of people are going to meet people that are different from them, from different communities. And as we have seen pretty much since George Floyd, that these issues seep into our organizations. Our organizations are just collectives of human beings trying to do something together, which is probably the biggest feat in humanity, right? Anytime we are trying to work together. So I would say the operationalization of racial and intersectional equity, racial equity, begin in the learning, right? There's a lot of that we need to do around our history to help contextualize how we got here in the first place. So we often find people in those workshops who are eager to do. And I remind folks, the learning is the doing. And I
Mhm.
told you before I was able to stand in front of a room and lecture around these things. I sat at many workshops unpacking the ways in which I had internalized racial inferiority or white supremacy and the way it was impacting my behavior. So the learning is the doing. So that's number one. And I want to give people credit for being on that journey. And then beyond that, I think that this assignment really calls us to work in the collective. This is culture work. This is not one person's assignment. This is not HR. This is not the board. This is not just the executive director. This has to be culture work. And so, one of the best ways to begin operationalizing is beginning to come together and create, a group of folks from different perspectives around the organization who are really going to hold this work for the collective. And by holding the work for the collective, that group is responsible for doing a lot of deep listening. So learning first, listening second, listening to one another, better understanding what we process as we've learned individually, but then also begin to think about what it means for these organizations. I would say the next step on that process is to really now start to hold a mirror up to the organization and go through the assessment process. And again, if folks haven't done the learning and the listening and they jump into the assessment, then there's often a blowback at that time. People don't like what
Yeah.
they see when it comes back. And that again, often happen when we've skipped those first steps of operationalizing the listening and the learning. So holding that mirror up is a really important collective activity. And I believe if entered into with a sense of humility and a sense of curiosity, a sense of openness, that what can come out of looking even at some of um, the un the unpretty parts of
Yeah.
our organizations can be really beneficial. Just the exercise of being willing to be courageous and do that together. Once we get to that space where an organization is able to do that and hold space for the processing of what they see, then a lot of work can happen to operationalize racial and intersectional equity. We see it show up in everything from revisiting our personnel policies to thinking about team building and culture to thinking about employee recruitment and retention to even thinking about the vendors that we work with, the partners that we select, how we think about and relate to our stakeholders. So it's really something that I think permeates the entire organization. But we really want to make sure people start in the learning, the listening, and then the reflect back to themselves um, before they really jump into let's operationalize something, let's jump out there, do the plan, because those three ingredients are actually going to tell us where we need to attend and what we need to do uh, following those processes.
It's so I love the language of reflecting because I think that really reminds it is hard for a lot of people to reflect on themselves, to see things that maybe they feel insecure about. I mean, and so many different levels, like um to see our what we're worried about reflected back on us is a hard place to be and really makes me think about the trust and love and support that needs to be in your community of your organization in order for people to be able to go through that experience of reflecting. And then, of course, if they haven't learned, they might not see, or they might see and be in such shock that they're not prepared. Um, that's great. Um, Anything else you wanna add about you hinted you've talked a little bit about gaps. Where do you see organizations needing to be careful? Where do you see them tending to skip steps? So, like,
Um,
pitfalls to
I would
avoid, I guess is my
say
question.
that we saw a lot of organizations skip steps, particularly after the George Floyd moment. So many folks were rushing in to do that. Some of those initial pieces were skipped. I think we were all shocked by having to be a witness to that. And I think that, it awoke it in very good ways. It broke through, us spiritually, right? And so we saw the world cry out for something different, changes. And I think in some of that, though, we did see lots of missteps. Um, Breaking open this, reflecting this back to an organization, it can bring up a lot of stuff that folks have, like you've already mentioned, insecurities, or folks feeling like, well, this is coming up and we don't have the tools to manage it, and manage the emotions, and the responses that can come up when the space and the collective hasn't been prepared for us. So I would say rushing into the doing and not preparing people along the way. I think another misstep, and I sort of mentioned it at the beginning, is it can't be one person's job. We understand, again, this is culture work. And so it has to happen inside of, we actually have to practice the principles around racial equity in attending to racial and intersectional equity. We have to practice that. And that really emphasizes the wisdom of the collective, and the work of culture, right? That's not a policy. That's not a procedure. It's not an SOP. It is really bringing people along a journey together and creating a group identity around a commitment to racial equity. And that requires that people deeply understand, like, one, how we got here, and two, how we all can begin to unpack this in our organization. So we really want to emphasize that people spend time, just like in any good change management process, preparing the collective to actually engage in this kind of work.
Yeah, you mentioned change management. One of the things that I see people skipping over in change management often is preparing, and then after you've changed, the letting go, that mourning period. I wonder what if you have thoughts, and I mean, it's just a new thought that popped into my head, so I'm kind of asking on the spot. But I haven't heard anybody talk about that, and I was wondering if you have thoughts about what happens after you changed. How do you help that change stick? How do you, um and maybe mourn isn't quite the right word, but that's the best word I have for when people are experiencing letting go of something that they no longer are doing.
Yeah, it's so interesting. We work with many organizations, and it's interesting. Sometimes we see people having these almost like trauma bonds with the dysfunction. And because
Mhm.
they're more comfortable in the way things have been when they are open to what is new. Um, I think there is a lot of support that could be provided, learning together, discovering together, making decisions together, prioritizing together, that all decisions can be made in the collective, but people along and explaining to people, letting people know, and letting people weigh in along the way where it makes sense. I think all those things can help in the change management process. I mean, that's change management 101. Um, and then I think ultimately leaders have to make really hard decisions. And it does come down to that sometimes. Leaders have had to make hard decisions about whether or not folks are going to be on board with the new direction and the new culture. Um, you know, Continuous learning, under helping people understand it's not a one-time topic, but this is something that we're going to continue to lean into and discover together. I think those can also invite people along the journey, but also giving people time. There is some time for integration that is really necessary. And then eventually, we have seen situations where folks have had to make decisions because, folks are not or unwilling to adapt. But I agree with you. I think that's a really important point, is how do we help people mourn what used to be in the midst of change? Is a really good point.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm thinking of an example as that coming up, but I also want to highlight well, I'll share the example, and then we'll then we'll highlight the letting people go, because I want to emphasize that for folks, cuz I'll start there. Because I often, oftentimes, especially I think in the nonprofit space, we have such heart-driven leaders. It's hard for everybody to let somebody go, but I just always like to any moment that's appropriate to highlight our job as leaders is not to be therapists or behavior people who change our employees' behaviors, right? If they don't want to behave in the way of the culture of our organization, then you need to free them to find their people, and you need to free up the space for your people to be your people. But the example, just in case, because sometimes I think having just a super real example, I race sailboats, so talk about a white male dominated culture that is working to change, and it is happening slowly. But I was at an event, and some older white guy he just wanted to make a racist joke. It was like one of his old jokes. And he was like, I know I'm not supposed to say this anymore, but he just kind of wanted to, you know, and in the moment I kind of was thinking about like, I was like, I was kind of like, really, that maybe there's a different joke you could come up with, but I also like that was part of his mourning process, and I could think probably somebody could have given him a way of acknowledging, right? Hey, yeah, and he understood that it was racist and why, but he missed his old joke, right? He needed a new joke, really, is what he needed, because there's nothing, jokes are fun and it's nice to make jokes, but not if they're at somebody else's expense. And I think it is possible to be funny without demoralizing others. But I could hear with somebody who was clearly needing a little support and to find a way to just make a joke in an evening over, drinks. But nobody gave him that path and nobody acknowledged, yeah, you lost one of your old jokes.
Mm.
Um, and so it was just one of those small moments. But life is full of those small moments of
Yeah.
dismantling racism and
Yeah.
prejudices and biases of all kinds.
Yeah. No, I mean, I do think that there is a space for a level of compassion for folks in terms of what they are being asked to give up. More than jokes, people are being asked to give up privilege. Um,
Yes,
so I may have a little bit more compassion for what it means to give up a real privilege than a joke. Um,
absolutely.
that
Hmm.
other. But, I do think that that has to be a real topic of conversation. I think we have to understand fear and the resistance is that's really speaking to. Most, we tell jokes when we're actually scared.
Yeah,
And sometimes that's a way of deflecting what's really going on with us, that we're afraid that we're about to lose something, that something is being taken away, and that somehow it diminishes our identity, right? Which is
yeah,
sort of interesting because that is what white supremacy is about. And that is also why, um, these are such tough conversations, because this is talking about unearned privilege, and the
yep,
unearned power that comes with that privilege um, to have that privilege at the expense of others. And I have a sense of compassion for what that means. All of us um, have a certain level of privilege in our lives, even as an
yeah,
African American woman, who is middle class, living abroad in a developing country. I have a level of privilege that other folks don't have. And I can't imagine, what it would feel like, and what my process would be of letting them go, of letting that go. I think what's required in order for me to make that exchange is understanding what that greater good is, right? We give up privileges on a daily basis for the greater good. And I think part of what this work in this moment, politically, historically, evolutionary, is about the willingness to give up a certain level of privilege for the greater good, including our leadership.
yes, yes. They come out, as you said, little jokes. I was thinking too, one, I think, area where we're used to giving up privilege culturally, if we need an example to turn to, is for our children. I think it's very
Yeah,
common for
every day.
parents to give up their privileges to lift their children up. Um, so that's an example of where we're used to doing that. And like you said, But there's real loss there for people. And if we don't help them lose gracefully, they'll resist. And that
That's
makes things
in a
harder.
real identity crisis too, right?
Yeah.
Because identity is attached to that. And now we're saying, hey, this may not be what you think it is. It may not be earned. This may not be meritocracy, right?
Right.
So, and then what does that mean for your identity? And to me, that's what that need to say that last little joke is about. Is me trying to hang on to that last morsel of, of what I feel like I might be giving up in this exchange
Yeah.
for the good.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's shift a little bit. I'd love to talk about how nonprofits and their leaders can be part of a larger shift in their communities.
Oh, absolutely. Well, big time. I mean, the work of the sector is really to attend to the needs of, humanity and our planet, So we come to this sector as humanitarians first and foremost. I always try to remember, what draws people to this because many of us are well educated and could be in another sector making, a lot more money for the skills and talents that we bring. But I believe, nonprofits play a huge role in civic society and, of course, in leading um, the culture shift work, I believe, in the world and in our country. So, the ways in which nonprofits shape our communities um, is invaluable. I believe they provide our communities vision. They provide our communities infrastructure to organize around different issues or topics or even, geographies together. They are our spaces to work out what solutions to societal problems. So I really think that nonprofits are well poised to lead this work in their community. So first in ourselves, second in our organization, and then I believe we're ready to expand this work into our community. So nonprofits play a key role, I believe, in the dissemination and the integration of this work, in all of our lives.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think there's so much there of leading by example. I mean, the history of nonprofits and charity and philanthropy in this country, in the US, where I am, and in Canada, is just plagued and part of the creating the systems of systemic racism. We are not like the good guys who are on the outside the whole time. We are very, very much part of how it all came about.
Yeah.
And so I think, but at the same time, I think if we look at nonprofits as a business sector compared to other business sectors, we're probably bent towards thinking about it more proactively because we put humanitarian stuff ahead of profits, like humanitarian change, the betterment of our communities is our primary objective. But if we can, I totally believe like if we can figure this out at nonprofits and in the nonprofit sector, we can be an incredible example. One of my own there's so many examples in the nonprofit sector, but my own work last year took me to looking at how nonprofit boards work and
Oh,
why do we have the nonprofit board job description that we have. And I started doing research. I couldn't find any research that proved that our current job description was proven to be effective in any way. So I was just like, well, where did this job description come from? And before I knew it, I was back to, what was it, 1630 and the founding of Harvard University.
wow.
And to make a long story short, but we had the wealthy merchant class who were also the Protestants coming over to the New World. They were trying to use their new money because at the time England had a monarchy or aristocracy. You got power by birth, not by money.
Right.
You got money with your birth too, but the power came from your bloodline. You did, and so these new merchant class, who were also the Protestants for the most part, were trying to use their money to gain power And it wasn't so easy because now money gets you power. But back then, it didn't necessarily get you power. So they were incorporating towns in the New World as businesses. And they had these nonprofits that, like Harvard was one of the first, and they were run originally by boards basically of staff. It was like an administrative leadership board. And then they needed to attract more funding. And in order to do that, they had to create boards of donors and give them influence over the organization. And there was a bunch of legal stuff. And basically, the court said no individual donor could just control everything. They at least had to act as a group. And that's where we get our job description that so many nonprofit boards are using. It's literally designed to give these wealthy Protestants, who are also white men, the maximum amount of power that they could have over these nonprofits. I mean, that is like literally systemic racism, like, lock, stock, and barrel, the whole thing. And people don't, it's what we're doing these days to run most of our boards. And that's one of the things I've been working to dismantle over the past year. Because once I was like that, it's like, no, yeah, we can't be perpetuating that system.
No,
it was designed.
I thank you for illuminating that history. I did not know that some of those decisions were made around Harvard, which doesn't surprise me. I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut, outside um, the walls of Yale University. So I know an Ivy League.
That's right.
I power when I see one. But I think that is really, really powerful. I mean, it speaks to, I always come back to history, the reason why it's so important to understand why we do what we do. So that was super enlightening. And then I think about, we do a lot of board development work at Converge. We work with a lot of boards around racial equity and even the development and cultivation of their board. It reminds me of a story. I was on a nonprofit board in New Orleans a few years ago, and it was a startup organization for a charter school. I remember we're having a conversation. I am the only Black woman at the board. I think there was one other Black man, about a 12-member board. And, we're going through the conversation around, who we could use for different vendors. And just as easily as it was like, almost like it was a done deal, someone's like, yeah, such and such, CPA, such and such, banker, such and such, and just kind of rolled off. This older white man just rolled off this Rolodex of the who's who. And it was one of those moments, earlier in my career where I really had to, muster the courage to say, wait a minute, hey, that's not up for debate. We're not questioning that. And so what I realized in that moment is nonprofits are also big businesses, right?
Yeah.
And the nonprofit sector, in addition to sort of being designed by some of the context that you shared, are huge employers in our communities, spend a lot of money. And when we don't diversify our board, right, and folks like me aren't there, and folks like me don't feel like they have the courage on that given day to interrupt the flow of the meeting, which everyone is just nodding their head to, then we don't
And
have
I just big highlight out that it takes a lot of courage to be that voice.
To be that person, right? When folks are just like, yep, that's the person we go to for that. That's the person. And what I realized, I was like, these firms have built entire departments around moments just like this, right? Where these could be opportunities for other small businesses of color in those communities. And this nonprofit who's committed to racial equity as far as its stakeholders concerned, doesn't even bat an eye as it makes all these decisions about all these other partnerships and business decisions that are coming out of this board. So I just want to double down that the board piece can't be forgotten in this larger conversation. There's so much power, so much influence. And I'm glad you're lifting up that context and that history to help us understand how that was even designed. But I do think back to your point around how do we operationalize? One of the ways we operationalize racial and intersectional equity is, interrupting conversation, like that. And really asking the organization to dig deeper when it thinks about making those decisions.
Yeah, I love that. We're pretty much at time. I've got a final question for you, but just since you brought up interrupting, it just reminded me one of the things that I love about work around racial justice is usually when it comes down to operationalizing things, it's the same activities that are also just plain old better for business. So it is a win. Like I'm often, for reasons totally unrelated to racial justice, encouraging organizations to develop a culture of speaking up, interrupting. Sometimes we call it like calling BS on each other, and often that comes in the context of team members overloading their plate. Say, no, we're not superhuman. No, you can't do those 10 things tomorrow, right? 2 sounds more realistic. Like when the workload gets too heavy, we're actually going to hire more people rather than give up our nights and weekends, right? But that's the same culture that stands up for racial justice, that says, hey, no, right? And if you're used to a culture where everybody's voice feels empowered and it's normalized to speak up, for anybody to speak up, for everybody to call out issues and challenges, then we have this ability to change so much so quickly. So I love that you brought up that interrupting, speaking up should, if we get comfortable with it, it becomes pretty easy.
I mean, I believe in it. Our mission is creating a radically just world where communities of color thrive. But we believe that because we know that when communities of color thrive or any disenfranchised community thrives, we actually all win. Right? Like,
Right.
whether it is affirmative action or cut curbs for the for the disabled, we know that we all win. And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely right that this is actually really good culture work, period, at the end of the day.
I love that. Any final words of wisdom for our folks out there? And if people want to work with you and your firm, how should they get in touch?
Oh, absolutely. So final words of wisdom, continue learning. This is a journey. This is not one workshop. You can't go and check the box and, experience the personal transformation or the collective transformation. We'll definitely stay in the learning and continue to try. I also want folks to give one another and themselves a lot of grace with this work. This, to your point, is very courageous work. And I just want to continue to encourage people, even in the wake of a lot of backlash recently around DEI. I want to continue to encourage people to stay on the path. And then last but not least, because you brought it up, we at Converge actually have a fabulous resource that we've created over the last 10 years with many partners called our board matrix. And what that does is it really rethinks and remixes who we should be looking for on our boards, all the various characteristics that your organization and attributes your organization may want to consider. So we'll make sure that that is available on our website, which is www.convergeforchange.com.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being here today and all of your courageous work out there. And thank you out there for listening, for all the courageous work you do in your communities. I've been an executive director, board member, secret toilet fixer, courageous woman sometimes, and now I'm a consultant and coach. And to help you even further develop your missions and make an impact, in addition to this podcast, I have created the Inspired Nonprofit Leadership newsletter where you can get bite-sized weekly tips delivered to your inbox, and you can access that at inspirednonprofitleadership.com/sign up. Until next time, take care of yourself, be courageous, be open, create space for racial justice and social justice in your communities. Prepare yourself for the mirror and subscribe and listen to the next episode of Inspired Nonprofit Leadership.
You've been listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. Thanks so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode or the bonus episodes. And while you're at it, please leave a rating and review, and be sure to share with your friends and colleagues. Tune in every week for more useful insights and wisdom on nonprofit leadership. Thanks so much for all you do for the communities you serve. Until next time, all the best.